You married my daughter because you wanted a free ride, didn't you? Those were the exact words my father-in-law, Douglas Vance, spit at me during our 10th family dinner since Melissa and I got married. It was a Sunday night. Roast beef, green beans, mashed potatoes. The usual suffocating, oversalted tradition. Except this time, the gravy wasn't the only thing boiling over. Melissa sat stiffly beside me, chewing like her jaw was wired shut. Her mother pretended she didn't hear. Her brother Mark laughed into his wine glass. I put my fork down slowly. What did you say? You heard me, Douglas said, tapping a greasy finger on the tablecloth. You think marrying into this family gives you a shortcut, a house, a job, a name that opens doors. But you haven't earned a damn thing. I've never been the type to cause a scene, especially not in someone else's house. But something in his eyes dared me to lash out, dared me to be the hot-headed loser he'd already written me off as. So I didn't say a word. I just stood up, picked up my plate, and calmly walked it into the kitchen. I'm Nathan Cole, by the way, 32, HVAC technician, homeowner, and, up until that moment, still trying to play the role of the dutiful son-in-law. Melissa and I had been married for 2 years. Met in a night class when I went back to school to finish my associates. She was smart, ambitious, worked in HR at a mid-sized logistics company. I liked that she didn't care about money, or cars, or titles, at least, not at first. But her father? Douglas Vance lived for that stuff. He owned a chain of luxury auto dealerships across the Southeast, and he let you know it in the first 5 minutes of meeting him. Country club tan, gold cufflinks, teeth too white to be real. He had a way of shaking your hand like he was trying to prove something. And when he looked at you, it wasn't eye contact, it was evaluation. The problem started the moment he found out I worked with my hands. HVAC, huh? He said when Melissa introduced me. Not bad. Honest work. You planning to do that forever? I laughed politely. Well, it's good money. Steady. I like solving problems. He nodded, but the message was clear. You're not good enough for my daughter. And that message never changed. No matter how often I fixed his broken boiler. No matter how many times I paid the dinner tab when he forgot his wallet. No matter how many Sundays I spent in that man's house, pretending we were family. Melissa told me to let it go. He's just set in his ways, she'd say. He thinks every guy is out to take something. I should have listened to my gut back then. But I didn't. Because I loved her. And when you're in love, you swallow the disrespect. You laugh off the comments. You tell yourself it's temporary. But that night, something changed. After dinner, Douglas cornered me in the garage while I was grabbing our coats. No witnesses. Just him, a whiskey glass, and that self-satisfied smirk. You think just because Melissa picked you, you're in the club? He said, voice low and sharp. Son, you're a blip. A phase. I give it another year before she realizes you're not man enough for this life. I didn't respond. I just stared at him. And in that moment, I realized something. He wasn't going to stop. He was never going to respect me. And Melissa, she wasn't going to make him. On the drive home, she barely spoke. When I finally asked if she agreed with what her father said, she just shrugged and muttered, he's just being dramatic. That hurt more than I expected. Not because Douglas was wrong, but because Melissa didn't even try to defend me. 2 days later, I came home early from a job and found something I wasn't supposed to see. Melissa was on the phone, standing in the hallway, door slightly cracked. I heard my name. Then I heard the words that flipped my world upside down. He's not like us, Dad. I know. But I'm trying, okay? I froze. Listen harder. He's good to me. He works hard. But sometimes I wonder if he'll ever really fit. Fit. Like I was a pair of jeans she wasn't sure she should have bought. When I opened the door, she jumped like she'd been caught stealing. Her smile was thin. Hey babe, I walked past her and into the kitchen without a word. She followed. That was my dad. He's worried about me. That's all. Worried about what? I asked, setting down my keys. That I don't earn enough? That I don't come from a trust fund? That I can't give you whatever fantasy life he thinks you deserve? She looked guilty, then angry. Why are you twisting this? I didn't say any of that. You didn't have to. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. That was the beginning of the end. But it wasn't the end of the story. Because I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I didn't even ask for a divorce. I just waited. Watched. Listened. Because if Douglas Vance thought I was nothing but a piece of trash drifting through his pristine family tree, then I'd let him watch exactly what that trash could do when pushed too far. And I wouldn't just walk away. I'd take everything he cared about with me. Over the next few weeks, I stopped asking Melissa how her day went. I stopped trying to impress Douglas at family gatherings. I stopped putting effort into proving I was a worthy addition to their immaculate little circle of wealth and status. because deep down, I'd finally understood the rules of their game. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked or how much I loved their daughter, I would always be treated like an outsider, tolerated rather than welcomed, handled rather than embraced. Melissa started spending more time at her parents' place, under the excuse of helping her mom with errands or planning a family fundraiser, but I knew it wasn't about errands, and it definitely wasn't about charity. It was about comfort. It was about stepping back into the house where she never had to explain herself, never had to defend her choices, and never had to reckon with the fact that she had married someone her father couldn't control or classify. The first real fracture came on a Thursday evening. I had just come home from a 12-hour shift fixing a busted commercial refrigeration system out in Pine Hill. I was covered in grime, exhausted, hungry, and all I wanted was a hot shower and a quiet dinner. Instead, I walked through the door to find Melissa standing in the kitchen, holding an envelope in her hands like it was radioactive. "This came today," she said, not bothering to greet me, not even looking up. "From some lender. A pre-approval?" I dropped my tool bag slowly onto the floor and glanced at the envelope. I had applied for a small business loan, something I hadn't told her about yet because it wasn't even real, not until the approval came through. "It's nothing serious," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just an inquiry." I was looking into the possibility of starting my own service. Maybe 2 or 3 guys. Residential and light commercial HVAC. She blinked at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "And when were you going to tell me about that?" "When it was worth telling. When it was more than just an idea." "So you're just making career decisions without me now?" Her voice had that sharpness to it, that defensive crack that always came when she felt she wasn't in control. "I'm not making decisions," I replied carefully. "I'm exploring possibilities." "Isn't that what you're always telling me I need to do? Think bigger?" Melissa dropped the envelope on the table like it had burned her fingers. "You're not a businessman, Nathan. You fix things. You're not equipped to run something." I don't know if she realized it, but that single sentence punched harder than anything her father had ever said. At least when Douglas insulted me, it came from a place of open contempt. But this was Melissa, the woman who'd promised to build a life with me, admitting that she saw me exactly the way her father did, a man with limits. I didn't say anything. I just walked past her, straight to the bathroom, turned on the shower, and let the scalding water burn the anger out of my chest. The following week, Melissa's brother Mark reached out to me through a LinkedIn message. Strange, considering we hadn't spoken one-on-one in almost a year, but I opened it anyway. He said he was checking in, wanted to grab a drink sometime, talk about opportunities, and even though I knew better, I met him for a beer that Friday. We sat in a sleek, overpriced bar filled with chrome furniture and dim lighting that made everything feel like a stock photo. Mark was already 2 drinks in, loosening his tie, telling stories about his job in fintech and laughing like we were best friends. After 20 minutes of small talk, he finally got to the point. "Look, I'll be honest with you, Nathan," he said, leaning in like we were co-conspirators. "Dad's worried about you. Not just about you, really. About Melissa. About what kind of future you're building." I smiled without humor. "Let me guess. He sent you to deliver the message he doesn't have the guts to say to my face." Mark shrugged. "You know how he is. Doesn't like confrontation unless he's already won it." "So what's the message?" "He's offering help. Guidance. If you're thinking about starting your own company, he can connect you with people, investors, lenders, mentors. But, and this is important, he wants you to slow down. Talk to Melissa. Get your ducks in a row. Don't embarrass her with a failed business because you didn't plan." I laughed, one of those deep, bitter laughs that scares the people around you more than it amuses them. "So that's the pitch? We'll help you succeed if you follow our playbook?" Mark looked uncomfortable now, like the conversation had strayed further than he'd expected. "I'm just saying, there's a way to do things. A way that keeps everyone from losing face." I stood up, finished my beer in one long gulp, and dropped a 20 on the table. "Tell your dad thanks, but I'll pass. I'd rather fail on my own terms than succeed on his." The moment I walked out of that bar, I knew things were going to get worse. And they did. Within a week, I started getting anonymous phone calls during work. No one on the line, just silence, and then a hang-up. Melissa's attitude at home grew colder, more businesslike. She started tracking our shared expenses more closely, asking for receipts, reminding me of how much we'd spent on our wedding, on furniture, on the house. She began sleeping on the far side of the bed, her back always turned, her phone always face down. Then came the police visit. It was a Wednesday morning. I was prepping tools in the back of my truck when a patrol car rolled up in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out, casual but alert, and asked me if I was Nathan Cole. I said yes, and they told me they were responding to a report about a disturbance between a husband and wife. Melissa had called it in, apparently after an argument the night before. Claimed I had raised my voice, thrown a wrench across the garage. I hadn't. We hadn't even argued. But the complaint was logged, and though no charges were filed, the warning shot had been fired. When I confronted Melissa about it later that night, she acted surprised. I didn't expect them to come out, she said, twirling her wine glass like we were having a casual debate. I just needed someone to know you were getting difficult. Difficult? I said, stunned. I haven't laid a hand on you, haven't even raised my voice. I'm not accusing you of violence, she replied, cool and collected. But emotional instability matters too, especially if we ever have to divide things. That was the moment it all clicked. I wasn't married anymore. Not really. I was in a Cold War, and Douglas was the one feeding her ammo. But the real twist came 2 nights later, when I received an envelope taped to our mailbox. No stamp, no name. Inside was a copy of an email chain between Douglas and a small local developer. My name came up twice. Once in a bullet point that read, "Son-in-law has ambitions. Best to lock down permits early in case he tries to launch in the same district." Douglas was sabotaging me behind the scenes. That was my tipping point. I didn't scream. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't threaten anything. I just sat on our back porch until 2 in the morning, planning, thinking, connecting dots. Because if Douglas wanted to play chess, I was done being the pawn. The night after I found that envelope, I didn't sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because for the first time in months, something resembling clarity had surfaced, cold and solid, like a long-lost coin at the bottom of a lake. I knew now that Melissa had picked a side, and it wasn't mine. I knew Douglas had never considered me family. But most importantly, I knew that this was no longer about a marriage or a misunderstanding. This was a campaign, a slow, quiet, and thoroughly coordinated effort to push me out of Melissa's life while preserving the Vance family's precious sense of control and legacy. So I decided I'd start learning their weaknesses, and not just through instinct or speculation. I needed facts, leverage, something that couldn't be brushed off with smirks or gaslighting. That meant finding someone who'd seen their real faces up close, someone who'd lived inside their circle but hadn't been claimed by it. As fate would have it, that person found me first. Her name was Janine, and she used to be married to Melissa's cousin Troy, a man who now lived in Phoenix, remarried, and hadn't spoken to the Van Cess in over 5 years. Janine and I had only ever exchanged polite small talk at family events, but she messaged me out of nowhere after hearing from a mutual friend that things between Melissa and me had taken a turn. We met for coffee in a quiet strip mall off the bypass, the kind of place people go when they want to have real conversations without being seen. "I don't mean to pry," she said, wrapping her fingers around the mug. "But when I heard what was going on, I figured it might be time for someone to finally tell you the truth about them." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. She took a breath and kept talking. "They do this, you know. Every time someone joins the family from the outside, someone they don't approve of, it starts with little things. Questions about where you're from, what you do. Then it becomes passive-aggressive remarks. Then it's social exclusion, whisper campaigns, rumors, gaslighting. And eventually, if you're not careful, they'll turn the person you married into a mirror version of them. Polished, detached, loyal only to the brand." "The brand?" I asked. Janine smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Douglas doesn't see people. He sees assets, liabilities, leverage. Melissa was always his favorite. Not because she was the smartest, but because she was the most loyal, the easiest to mold. Troy used to say she was more like him than anyone realized." I felt my stomach twist. "So this isn't personal. It's just what they do." "Oh, it's personal," Janine said. "They hate that you didn't need them to become who you are. They hate that you don't grovel for their approval. They call that pride. I call it self-respect. And Douglas hates self-respecting men unless he owns them." She leaned in then, and what she said next changed everything. "Have you ever heard of Vance Enterprises Holding Group?" I shook my head. "It's Douglas's shell company, separate from the dealerships. It's where he hides the pieces of his life he doesn't want under public scrutiny. Properties, slush funds, non-disclosed investments. And more importantly, where he launders influence, bribes contractors, buys zoning board votes, thinks no one's watching because it's technically not in his name." That caught my attention. "How do you know this?" "Troy did some accounting for them before the split. He saw things. So did I. But Douglas scared the hell out of him. Told him if he ever spoke up, he'd make sure he never worked again in the state. So he moved to Arizona, and erased the last name from his life. I stared at her, trying to process the implications. Why are you telling me this now? Because I saw what they did to Troy, and I see what they're trying to do to you. The difference is, Troy ran. You still have a chance to turn this on them, but you're going to need proof. What kind of proof? Janine reached into her bag and pulled out a thumb drive. Emails, transaction records, property titles, a folder labeled consulting expenses that's just a list of bribes, including one to a city inspector who approved a condemned building for demolition in exchange for a private golf club membership. It's not enough for prison, but it's more than enough to ruin him publicly. And if he thinks you're just some blue-collar idiot who doesn't know how to use it, that's your advantage. I took the drive in my hand, stunned. Why are you really giving me this? She exhaled slowly. Because I've waited a long time for someone to punch that man in the soul. And if you don't, no one will. That night, I didn't go home. I told Melissa I was working late, but instead, I drove an hour out of town to a quiet motel, plugged in the drive, and sat for 3 hours reading everything. Janine hadn't exaggerated. The documents were real, sloppy in places, meticulously hidden in others. And one name appeared more than once, Melissa's. Not in any criminal way, but in a complicit way. Forwarded emails. CC'd on deals. Signed meeting logs. At some point in the last year, she had become a quiet cog in the Vance machine, helping move paperwork without asking questions, probably under the guise of being helpful or loyal. And suddenly, I saw it all clearly. Melissa hadn't changed overnight. She hadn't been stolen. She had been drifting, inch by inch, excuse by excuse, into her father's world. And I had let her, thinking love was enough to hold her tethered. But now I had something her father didn't expect, information, and that was about to become power. 2 days later, I walked into the Vance family's country estate with a smile so calm it made Melissa blink twice when she opened the door. The family had gathered there for Douglas's birthday dinner, a yearly production that felt more like a board meeting in suits than a celebration. Melissa wore a dark green dress she knew Douglas liked, her hair styled precisely, her posture rehearsed. I showed up in work boots and a plain button-down shirt, and I didn't apologize for either. I was done performing. Inside, everything was polished, the lighting soft, the silverware real, the wine pre-selected. Douglas stood near the fireplace, holding court with Mark and 2 executives from one of his dealerships. When he saw me, his smirk barely registered. I nodded politely, and he returned it with the expression of a man humoring a house cat. Dinner began like it always did, chatter about markets, acquisitions, a light jab at whatever news scandal Douglas thought was funny. Melissa played hostess, passing dishes, laughing in all the right places, but her eyes kept drifting toward me. Maybe she sensed something. Maybe the silence between us had changed shape, become sharper. She hadn't mentioned the motel night, hadn't asked why I'd come home late smelling like cigarettes and motel soap. She didn't want the answer. When the dessert came, some overly elaborate creme brulee brought out by the housekeeper, Douglas stood to give a speech. He spoke about legacy, about hard work, about loyalty. He dropped names of former associates like they were war stories. Then, as if choreographed by some higher cynicism, he looked directly at me. And let's not forget those who join the family and bring their own grit. Sometimes all it takes is marrying into the right name to change your whole future. Isn't that right, Nathan? The room laughed, half-hearted and unsure. I looked around the table, saw Mark grinning, saw Melissa looking down, saw the mother pretending she hadn't heard. No one said anything. No one ever did. I stood up, quietly, deliberately, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with the kind of sound that silences a room better than any shout. You know what, Douglas? I said, my voice calm but unmistakably final. You're right. Marrying into your family did change my future. It taught me exactly what kind of man I never want to become. Douglas cocked his head like a predator bored of the chase. Careful, son. Emotions don't win you respect. I reached into my pocket and slid a manila envelope across the table toward him. He looked down at it, confused for the first time. He didn't touch it. No one did. I thought long and hard about whether you were worth the trouble, I said, locking eyes with him. Then I realized, you're not the trouble. You're just the symptom. This whole family operates like a corporation. Everything's about positioning, leverage, optics. No one actually loves each other in this house. They just manage each other. Melissa stiffened beside me. Nathan, she said, her voice thin with warning. Maybe we can talk about this later. No, I said, cutting her off without looking at her. Now is good. Douglas's fingers finally touched the envelope. He pulled out the first page. One of the consultant invoices listing an unregistered property acquisition tied directly to Vance Enterprises Holding Group. His expression changed, subtly, but enough. He knew what this was. He flipped to the second page, an internal email thread that hinted at a zoning bribe. Then a list of slush payments tied to local officials. By the fourth page, his hand stopped moving. He looked up, but this time, the smirk was gone. "What is this supposed to be?" he asked. The air in the room turned thick. "This," I said, "is the preface. The full file's been sent to a lawyer I hired 2 weeks ago. Civil case, not criminal, for now. But if I wanted to, I could bury you under paperwork for a year. I could leak just enough to cost you investors, blow up your clean image, maybe even force a federal audit. And I wouldn't need to lift a finger. Just one USB drive." "You're bluffing," he said, but I saw the flicker. Doubt. Real, human, unfiltered doubt. I leaned forward. "You spent years calling me a parasite, a burden, a leech. But the truth is, you were always afraid of one thing. Someone with nothing to lose. And I don't care about your money. I don't care about your approval. But I care about watching you squirm the second you lose control." Melissa stood up beside me, her hands trembling. "Where did you get that information, Nathan?" I turned to face her, finally, and for the first time in months, I saw her for who she really was. Not the woman I'd married, not the person I'd built a life with, but someone who had spent the last year slowly becoming her father's daughter, all ambition and allegiance, no spine. "It doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you never stood up for me. Not once. Not when he insulted me. Not when he tried to sabotage me. Not even when he sent your brother to manipulate me over drinks. You want a father who controls your marriage? You've got one. But I won't be here for the next chapter." Douglas stood up now, slow and measured, trying to regain footing, trying to take back the room. "You think this little stunt scares me? You think I haven't had people try to threaten me before?" I picked up my coat and walked to the end of the table. "I don't want you scared, Douglas. I want you embarrassed. I want the people you play tennis with to whisper about you. I want your country club friends to ask why the city inspector resigned last week. I want you to know, deep in your chest, that I could have taken everything from you and chose not to." Melissa followed me into the hallway, her heels clicking like gunshots on the marble floor. "You're destroying everything," she hissed. "You're burning it all down." "No," I said, turning back to her with calm certainty. "I'm setting it free. You just don't know what freedom feels like anymore." I walked out the front door without another word, got in my truck, and drove away into the darkness. My hands were steady on the wheel, my heartbeat low, and for the first time in years, I felt clean. 2 weeks passed before I heard anything. No phone calls, no emails, no uninvited visits to my job site. Silence, thick and absolute, like the eye of a storm that had finally passed after circling for years. I spent those days in my new place, a modest rental outside town, half-furnished and echoey, but peaceful in a way I hadn't felt since before Melissa's last name became mine. The strange thing was, I didn't miss her. I missed who I thought she was. The woman I met in night classes, the one who made fun of my broken-down truck and brought me coffee on test days, the woman who made me believe marriage was a partnership, not a negotiation. But once I stopped trying to fix what she and her family had fractured, I saw it clearly. There was never a real us. Only me, adjusting and enduring. Then the email came. It was from her. Short. No apology, no grand emotional confessions. Just 5 lines. "Dad stepping back from some projects. He says you won. I think we both lost something. Hope that helps you sleep better. M." I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I understood now that there was no conversation left worth having. The damage wasn't in what she'd done. It was in what she hadn't stopped. And deep down, I think she knew it. From what Janine told me later, Douglas had quietly dissolved 2 of his shell companies and pulled out of a pending land acquisition that would have landed him in court with a local environmental group. The city inspector named in the files had resigned. No press coverage, no scandal, just a name disappearing off the books. His lawyers were likely running interference nonstop, plugging leaks, adjusting ledgers, revising contracts to make the dirt harder to trace. He'd survive, of course. Men like him always do, but the shine on his image was duller now, and the circles he used to dominate began shifting subtly away from him. Not because they feared he was guilty, but because they feared he was no longer untouchable. I'd done what I came to do, and yet, even in victory, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like subtraction, like the removal of something rotten that had been poisoning my sense of self. Douglas wasn't gone. Melissa wasn't ruined. Their world continued spinning, but without me orbiting it anymore. The real win, I realized, was never making them fall. It was walking away before they could pull me down with them. Months passed. I focused on the business. Got my loan approved. Hired my first 2 techs, a kid fresh out of trade school and an older guy laid off after 20 years in commercial refrigeration. We wore our names on our uniforms, worked long hours, and didn't pretend to be more than we were. Honest work. No handshakes with devils. No borrowed names. On my birthday, Janine texted me a photo, her and Troy, back in touch, smiling over drinks in Phoenix. Survivors find each other, the caption read. I didn't reply right away, just stared at the screen, thinking how strange and simple healing can feel when you finally stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. That night, I sat on my porch with a beer in my hand, stars overhead, dirt on my boots, no fancy cars in the driveway, no forced smiles across dinner tables, no one playing judge over my worth. And for the first time since stepping into the Vance family home, I realized something important. Being underestimated might have been the greatest advantage I ever had. Because while they spent years trying to figure out how to manage me, I figured out how to be free.